The time I ruined my high school teacher's career and got her fired in the greatest way possible. This story is widely known amongst my family and is constantly brought up and joked about in my group of friends, even years later. A buddy of mine suggested that this is the perfect place to make it public, so let's get into this shitstorm. Backstory: I was a senior in high school at the time, and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student, and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important because to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade and was widely known for being a petty, heartless bitch who administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject, so naturally I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some, these questions are easily answered, but to me, it was rocket science. Usually, when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again. Wow, surprise, surprise, you don't understand it again?" Or, "Really? We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we?" etc., etc. I tried going to the administration about it before, but again, she would be considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class. She would act respectful and normal for one day and go back to being a bitch the next. This goes on for about half the year until I've had enough. I went to the local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate to make up for the lost time. Go ahead, feed that fire. Fast forward to the end of the year, and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I asked a question. Her response, and I quote, because it's burned into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for more than 10 years, and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come out of anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering, and I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. We were allowed to dismiss ourselves if we were 18. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece of insults, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal, and we listened to a couple of insults before they stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present as well as Mrs. Frank's. He told me we would meet the next day where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walk into school that next morning being the most nervous I've ever been for anything. I was called down to the office where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal, and Mrs. Franks. What follows was some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators went from fed up with being in another useless meeting to furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Frank go from confident and stuck up to her realizing that she had fucked up beyond repair. She was publicly roasting herself in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended, and without hesitation, the administration looked around in astonishment. And the principal turns to me and says, "I think we have heard everything we need to. Thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes as I gave the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off her connections she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially because no school district in the area would hire the walking piece of garbage. And if you're reading this, Mrs. Frank, or if you're listening to this, because that's another person who knows that you're an asshole, he'd like to take this moment to tell you to go fuck yourself. Too long didn't read? My high school teacher belittled me. Oh yeah, belittled. I secretly recorded her, showed her the administration, and got her fired, as well as making it impossible for her to find work. The top comment reads, "Damn, I love that it was her own words that were her undoing." Bing bong, ladies and gentlemen. Bing bong.